Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Over the past month or so, really since UFC 291, there has been a lot of controversy surrounding the welterweight division, and in particular, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, since he missed his fight versus Michel Pereira at UFC 291. And we're going to discuss it all in this video. We're going to discuss whether or not the UFC was scummy by not paying Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. We're going to talk about Bloody Elbow, who put out an article earlier today saying it's the media's fault that Stephen Wonderboy Thompson did not get paid by the UFC. My opinion on that might surprise you a bit, but it all led me to the conclusion, and I've been saying this for a month now, the UFC needs to cut Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. And before you sit there and type in the comments and say, that's too harsh, Joey, the UFC doesn't need to cut Wonderboy Thompson. That is a lot more charitable than what I believe is actually going to happen to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson because of the whole back and forth with the UFC. I believe cutting Wonderboy Thompson would be better for his career than what I think the UFC is planning on doing, and we're going to discuss that later in the video. So if you don't know the backstory, you had Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Michel Pereira at UFC 291. Michel Pereira shows up, he misses weight, I believe it was 3 pounds over, and usually what happens when a fighter misses weight, they forfeit a portion of their purse, 20%, 30% of their purse. They forfeit that to their opponent. So if they're making $100,000, let's say it's 30% of their purse, $30,000 goes to their opponent. Let's say it's $200,000 and it's 30%, $60,000 goes to their opponent. Their opponent gets that because now their opponent has an advantage because they didn't have to cut weight all the way down. Well, Michel Pereira misses weight. They try to negotiate back and forth. Wonderboy turns down the fight, is unwilling to fight Michel Pereira now that he has missed weight. So a lot of people blame Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. A lot of people blame Michel Pereira for missing weight. And I felt like I was kind of in between. And the true backstory to this entire situation, and the reason I was so hard on Wonderboy Thompson, is because if you followed Wonderboy Thompson's career over the past 2 years, I followed his entire UFC career, but really over the past 2 years, Wonderboy has become very selective at who he's willing to face in the UFC. He's very selective. He's turned down Shavkat Rakhmonov and said, I'm not fighting Shavkat. He's a grappler. I don't want to fight him. Meanwhile, Shavkat Rakhmonov's getting all this hype. He's surging up the ranks. He's close to Wonderboy in the rankings. I don't remember exactly where Shavkat was when Wonderboy was offered that fight. But he says, nah, I'm not fighting him. He's a grappler. Keep in mind, Shavkat Rakhmonov is just an MMA fighter. He's a well-rounded fighter. He's not like Khabib Nurmagomedov. He has good grappling, but he's a well-rounded fighter. And Wonderboy has been known over the last 2 years to essentially say, I only want favorable matchups. I only want fun fights. He's even really come out and said those types of things and kind of alluded to it. Look, I'm not really willing to fight these types of guys and that type of guy. Because you go back to December 18th of 2021, he fought Belal Muhammad. Belal Muhammad could be considered a grappler. Belal Muhammad went out there, out-grappled Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. The fight before that, he fought Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns, a jiu-jitsu guy, has some decent wrestling. He gets out-grappled. Wonderboy gets out-grappled by Gilbert Burns. So you have Wonderboy, who's now lost 2 out of his last 3 because he got a fight since those 2 losses. He was on a 2-fight losing streak. But really, since he lost to Belal Muhammad and got out-grappled, he's like, no, I don't want to fight any more grapplers anymore. Even though he's ranked in the top 10 of the division, he is squatting on his ranking. And I made a video about the ranking squatters in the UFC, which I'll link down in the description, because Wonderboy's a very particular, a very unique ranking squatter, because typically when you're in the top 10 of the division, when you're in the top 5 of a division, you have a lot of UFC fighters who say, I'm not fighting that guy. He's behind me in the ranks. No way I'm fighting him. He's behind me. I'm only looking forward. I want to fight for the belt. Wonderboy's the type of guy, and this is the way he's been, he wants to fight unranked contenders who are favorable matchups to him. So you look at him and you say, oh, he recently said, I want to move towards a title. That's why I didn't want to fight Michel Pereira after he missed weight. Wonderboy, I believe at that point in time, was ranked number 7 or number 8 in the UFC rankings. Currently, right now, he's sitting at number 7. I don't remember if he's changed over the past couple weeks or so. He was fighting number 15, Michel Pereira. Does that seem like a guy who wants to fight towards a title? Does that seem like a guy who has title aspirations? No, it doesn't seem like a guy who has title aspirations, especially when you take into account that he's 40 years old. So then you look at his last fight, he fought Kevin Holland. Oh, well, Kevin Holland, oh, he's ranked in the top 15. At the time, Kevin Holland was unranked. Kevin Holland was unranked when Wonderboy fought him. Wonderboy was a top 10 fighter on the verge of a top 15 fighter, and he's saying, you know what? I'll fight Kevin Holland because he's a striker. So you have Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who's only willing to fight strikers. He's only willing to fight favorable matchups. So when he gets the Michel Pereira fight, Michel Pereira, primarily a striker, primarily a favorable matchup for Wonderboy. I'm like, okay, he's going to take the fight even though he missed weight because he's not looking to fight towards a title anyway. He turns down the fight and he says, well, look, I'm trying to make a run at a title. I'm trying to make one last run at a title, which I think is absolutely insanity considering the trajectory of his career over the past 2 years. He doesn't appear to be in any way, shape, or form trying to move towards a title. He turns down the fight. And you had a lot of people come out and defend Wonderboy Thompson and say, oh, why should he be forced? You got to make the weight. You got to be professional. And I do understand that to an extent. That, okay, Michel Pereira is unprofessional. He should have made the 170-pound weight limit. But at the same time, when you're a fighter sitting in the top 10, squatting on the top 10, who's only willing to fight fighters who are behind you, fighters that you think you can beat, and fighters who are primarily strikers, and then the guy comes in and misses weight, he's going to give you a percentage of his purse, and now you're still not willing to take the fight, it's a bit annoying to me. It's a bit frustrating to me, and I understand why the UFC would be frustrated. And then you had the whole bloody elbow aspect to it, where Bloody Elbow is saying the UFC needs to pay Stephen Wonderboy Thompson his show money. If you don't understand how purses work in MMA, you get a show money and you get win money. And essentially, let's say you get paid $100,000. I'm just making up a number here. You get $100,000 to show up and fight. You get a $100,000 win bonus if you win. Now, people are saying that Wonderboy Thompson should get his show money because he went through camp, he showed up, he made the weight, but he still was unable to fight because his opponent missed weight. And while I understand that to a certain extent, I understand Wonderboy Thompson showed up, he made weight. He didn't show up for fight night. He did not show up for fight night. Unless that's guaranteed in the contract, the UFC is under no obligation to pay Wonderboy. Would it be nice if they paid Wonderboy? Sure. But they're in the UFC's mind, they're already thinking, oh, so we're giving this guy favorable matchups. We gave him Kevin Holland in his last fight, who was unranked. We're giving him Michel Pereira in this fight, who's a striker, who's ranked way behind Wonderboy. We're giving him these favorable stylistic matchups. And now, even with 20 or 30% of Michel Pereira's purse, he's still not willing to fight on this massive card when he knows he's never going to sniff a title ever again in his entire career. Okay, well, the days and the weeks went on and people were saying, is the UFC going to pay him? And Wonderboy came out and said, Dana White's on vacation. I'm sure they're going to take care of me, when he gets back. And we've still yet to hear anything. I'm assuming that the UFC did not pay Wonderboy. I'm assuming they did not pay Wonderboy. Now, my thoughts on this are, I kind of agree with the UFC, but I kind of disagree. And I don't know exactly. We don't have confirmation of what went on behind the scenes. If it was up to me, if I'm running the UFC and I'm running it in an ethical manner, or it's my decision, I get to decide what happens with Wonderboy, I would encourage the UFC to pay him enough to cover his training camp. Whether that's $25,000, whether that's $50,000, I'm not sure what the actual number would be, but I don't think Wonderboy Thompson should lose money because he turned down a fight against a guy who missed weight. He showed up, he made weight. But at the end of the day, let's say Wonderboy gets paid $200,000. Let's say he gets paid $300,000. Whatever you want to call it, whatever number you want to call it. Do you really think the UFC is going to part with $300,000, $200,000 to a guy who refused to fight, regardless of the circumstances? And the next best scenario is to rebook that fighter for a fight very soon. We've seen this happen before where fights get canceled, maybe an injury, maybe another opponent missed weight, but he can't even get close to weight. The fight's canceled for whatever reason. The UFC finds him another opponent a week later, or 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, very soon, so that their training camp is not wasted and they still get a paycheck. Well, guess what? The UFC supposedly, and Dana White was a little bit odd with his word choice and nobody followed up because the MMA media absolutely sucks. But he said, we offered him Ian Gary. Now, I don't know if that was offering him Ian Gary the night of UFC 292 because Ian Gary's opponent fell out in Jeff Neal, or it was they offered Wonderboy Ian Gary after Ian Gary beat Neil Magny because Ian Gary called out Wonderboy in his post-fight speech. Either way, we know, according to Dana, which again we have to take with a grain of salt, we know that Stephen Wonderboy Thompson turned down Ian Gary. He's probably like, oh, I don't want to fight this prospect. I don't want to fight this guy. He looked too good. Look at him in the clinch against Neil Magny. I don't want any of that. If you wrestled in elementary school, Wonderboy Thompson does not want to fight you. He does not want to fight you if you have any wrestling ability, any jiu-jitsu ability. He only wants favorable matchups. So he turns down Ian Gary either at UFC 292, where he could have stepped in 2 weeks later, a week later, however many days after the original Michel Pereira fight was. I think it was actually 3 weeks later. And he turns down that. He either turns it down the night of, or he turns it down a month or month and a half from now. Ian Gary says he wants to get right back in there. He says he wants to fight Wonderboy Thompson. So now Wonderboy Thompson's in a place where, he doesn't want to fight Michel Pereira. He doesn't want to fight any wrestlers. He doesn't want to fight any up-and-comers. He just wants hand-picked opponents. That is all that Stephen Wonderboy Thompson wants. He wants to pick out opponents that he thinks are favorable matchups to him, and he says, okay, I'll fight that guy. I think I can win that fight. I got a good chance of winning that fight. And the fact that he had the audacity when he turned down the Michel Pereira fight to say, look, I'm trying to make one last run at the title. What? Have you looked at the welterweight division lately? Okay, number 1, Kamaru Usman, and we're going to talk about Kamaru Usman in a second. Number 2, Colby Covington. Number 3, Bilal Muhammad. Number 4, Hamzat Chimaev. Number 5, Gilbert Burns. Number 6, Shavkat Rakhmonov. Those are all 6 of the guys who were in front of Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Oh, guess what all those guys have in common? They're somewhat grapplers. Shavkat Rakhmonov, according to Wonderboy Thompson's a grappler. And even after I'll never forget this, and I wish I could find the tweet. Shavkat Rakhmonov put out something, kind of a jab at Wonderboy, saying, I'm not a grappler, because he had primarily a striking battle with Jeff Neal. And Wonderboy responded like, you still got a submission. Something along those lines. This guy is afraid to fight wrestlers. He is afraid to fight wrestlers. I said this in a previous video. People, when talking about the BMF belt, they've said, we need another belt, the NMF, the nicest MFer. And we need to put it on the line for Wonderboy Thompson. No, we need a PMF. He is a pussy motherfucker. He does not want to fight. He doesn't want to fight certain matchups. And that is why I believe the UFC needs to cut him. Wonderboy Thompson needs to be cut from the roster. And you have recently Bloody Elbow coming out, which I don't know why anyone would ever take any financial advice from Bloody Elbow. But you have them recently come out. They put out an article and said it's the MMA media's fault that Stephen Wonderboy Thompson didn't get paid. Now, I do admit, the MMA media doesn't follow up on a lot of stuff, and I absolutely hate it. They don't ask decent questions ever to Dana White out of fear of being banned from the press conferences. But at the end of the day, it's on Wonderboy Thompson. The UFC, in my opinion, if everything we've heard is actually true, which every bit of anecdotal evidence leads me to believe it, Wonderboy Thompson was offered a fight with an extra bonus against Michel Pereira. He turned that down. He was offered a replacement fight a couple weeks later. He turned that down. At what point is the UFC liable for this anymore? They offered him ways to fulfill his contract, to fight and get paid. He was unwilling to do so, even after being shown favoritism by the UFC. And I just think it's ridiculous to blame the MMA media for that. And I love blaming the MMA media. That is not the case in this scenario. And the UFC, if they look at Wonderboy Thompson, they're like, this guy's squatting in the top 10. He's not willing to fight up-and-comers. He's like, I'm not going to be a gatekeeper. Oh, well, wait a second. Okay, well, then you got to fight forward. Oh, I'm not fighting any wrestlers. Oh, wait, the entire division ahead of him has wrestling ability, is well-rounded, because guess what? It's mixed martial arts. It's not kickboxing, Wonderboy. So everyone in front of you has some grappling ability. You don't want to fight them. Oh, well, okay, you want to hand-picked opponents from usually outside the top 15 of the rankings. That's essentially what Wonderboy wants. And the welterweight division as a whole is an absolute catastrophe. If you want me to make a dedicated video on the welterweight division, let me know down in the comments. Right now, only 2 fighters in the welterweight division are booked for fights. And that is Kevin Holland and JDM, Jack Della Maddalena. That's the only fight that's currently booked in the entire welterweight division. This division has been in shambles for literally years. For literal years. Nobody wants to fight each other. If you want a video about that, let me know. I'm not going to get into that right now. The only other thing I want to discuss is you have Wonderboy right now. He's saying, I want to fight Kamaru Usman, which I know kind of goes against everything I said. Oh, Wonderboy doesn't want to fight grapplers. He's making a calculated decision here. He looks at Kamaru Usman. He said, Kamaru Usman's getting up there in age. Kamaru Usman's coming off a KO and then a loss to Leon Edwards, where his takedowns were stuffed, where he looked kind of slow, where his wrestling didn't look as good. It looked like his skills have regressed. And Wonderboy's looking at Kamaru Usman and saying, Kamaru Usman's ranked number 1. Maybe I can beat him. Even though he's a wrestler, you never really see anymore Kamaru Usman Go out there. I mean, even against Leon Edwards in the last fight, he didn't shoot as much as people thought he would. And a lot of people feel like he's fallen off a cliff skill-wise, a bit. I don't personally feel that way. I think Kamaru Usman would beat Wonderboy Thompson. But what Wonderboy wants is, after all these years of ducking certain guys, he's like, look, give me Kamaru Usman. If I can beat Kamaru Usman on the downslope, I'll sit out and I'll say I've earned a title shot. That's what he wants to do. That's the only reason he's calling out Kamaru Usman. He thinks Kamaru Usman is the highest ranked guy right now in the division, and he thinks Leon Edwards got the best of him in the last 2 fights. Maybe I can do the same. Maybe his chin's gone. Maybe his skills are regressing even more. He's getting up there in age with me. Maybe I can beat him, and then I can claim I've earned a title shot. And that's what Wonderboy wants to do with the Kamaru Usman fight. And Kamaru Usman, don't even get me started on him. He wants Wonderboy Thompson apparently too. But that's not what I believe is going to happen at all. Because the reason I say cutting Wonderboy Thompson is more charitable than what I think the UFC is going to do. If they cut Wonderboy Thompson, he can go to Bellator, he can go to PFL, which may merge into one company soon. He can go to kickboxing, he can go to one championship, he can go anywhere he wants. And Wonderboy, I think, would have a lot of success in those other organizations which don't have as stacked welterweight divisions. So he might be able to go win the $1 million over in PFL if they're willing to sign him. He might be able to go have success over in Bellator. Now, that's a little bit different because the champion there, could potentially easily out-grapple him. But nonetheless, if they cut him, he can go on and make money elsewhere. He's a name in the sport. He's a fun fighter to watch. But what I think the UFC is actually going to do, the UFC is very vindictive. And I think the UFC, what they're going to do now is they're just going to offer Wonderboy the worst possible matchups. Oh, here, we got a fight available for you, Shavkat Rakhmonov. Oh, guess what? Kelvin Gastelum fell out of his fight with Rakhmonov. Shavkat's still looking for a fight. Usman's not willing to take it, neither is Wonderboy. They're going to offer him Shavkat. He turns it down. They're going to automatically extend his contract. They're going to say, oh, Shavkat's got a fight booked. And Wonderboy's now he's pining. Oh, I want another fight. I want another fight while Rakhmonov is booked. Oh, guess what? You want to fight this new up-and-comer, Rinat Fakhretdinov? You want to fight him now, Wonderboy? A guy who's coming up the welterweight ranks, who's not currently ranked in the top 15, but he's getting very close, who looks like an absolute savage, who has unbelievable wrestling ability and nasty ground and pound. They're going to be like, oh, you want to fight Rinat now? And Wonderboy's going to be like, oh, nah. So what the UFC is going to do is they're going to keep offering him matchups that are not favorable to him. They're going to keep offering him the worst possible matchups. And Wonderboy's going to keep turning him down, and the UFC is just going to ice him because of it. Don't be surprised if in the very near future you see Wonderboy Thompson versus either Shavkat Rakhmonov or Rinat Fakhretdinov. The best case scenario for Wonderboy. He turns him down, he just sits out, and basically that's the end of his career. The best case scenario is for him to be cut from the organization, go elsewhere, or potentially fight Ian Machado Gary, which he's already been open about. Supposedly, he does not want that fight. Now, maybe they book Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus Ian Machado Gary for MSG in November, UFC 295. That is real. There's real potential there, and at least Ian Gary is a striker, so Wonderboy might be inclined to take it because he's like, all right, it's either Shavkat or Ian Machado Gary. I'll take Ian Machado Gary because he's a striker. He looks like he's really good, looks really impressive, but ultimately, I'm just tired of having guys in the organization who are just unwilling to fight, who only want favorable matchups, and that is exactly what Stephen Wonderboy Thompson is doing. I don't think it's right. The UFC should at least cover his training expenses, but at the end of the day, it's Wonderboy's fault. He doesn't want to fight. He only wants select matchups. So I want the UFC to cut Wonderboy Thompson. Let him have some success and go to other organizations because he's just clogging up a spot in the top 10 of the welterweight division. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.